if you look at the curve, you start to see significant economic damages above 2 degrees of warming, and it starts to ramp up rapidly above 1.5 degrees. We're not just talking about economic damages, we're talking about loss of life, mass mortality, heat stress, involuntary mass migration, breadbasket failure, water stress, and so on.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Sandy, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Rachel, thank you for the invitation. I'm absolutely honoured and also humbled looking at other guests you've had on Planet Critical previously, so thank you very much.
Oh, that's very kind of you. My first very broad question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
Such a good question. Such a big question. There's lots of ways we could go with this. Let's get straight into it. So I'm going to put it back to you and the listeners, actually. Imagine you get a call from the president or the prime minister of your country, and they say, Rachel, I've had some conflicting advice on climate change. I need your help. What's going to happen here? We're at 1.2 degrees of warming today. There's quite a lot of bad stuff happening. What might happen when we get to 3 degrees of warming? Will it be 2% GDP loss, economic damages of 2% of GDP, or will it be 80% GDP loss, like we lose everything? So help me, what do you think? Is it 2% GDP damages at 3 degrees of warming, or is it 80? Do you have a thought on that one, Rachel? What's your gut?
I mean, my gut instinct would be closer to the catastrophic end of the loss.
80.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a question I've put to several rooms of people currently when talking about this report, and they all say 80. Okay, everyone gets this is really bad, climate emergency. So let's just dig into the two. How do you get to 2? Well, what you do is this. You look backwards and you say, what happened previously when it got a bit hotter? And people did a bit less work because it was hot. So that's one of your assumptions. In the future, if it gets hotter, people do less work, right? The other thing you do is you say, well, climate change impacts weather. So anybody who works indoors won't be impacted by climate change. So we can exclude 87% of the economy from our analysis. Yeah.
This is Nordhaus, isn't it? William Nordhaus.
Yes, this is Nordhaus. Top marks. Top marks. You get the first prize.
And he won the Nobel Prize for it.
Correct, because it was such a brilliant piece of work. Now, to be fair, he did what we do in risk management. We look backwards at what has happened, and we use that to project forwards. But the difficulty with that approach is, by definition, you don't capture any risks which haven't yet happened. So we're effectively looking backwards from the deck of the Titanic on April 1912 and saying it's been a pretty smooth voyage so far. I don't see any problems. And of course, when you look at tipping points, and we can talk a little bit more about tipping points. There are many significant problems coming which we've never faced before and which you have to take into account. So to use that Titanic analogy again, just because the Titanic hasn't yet been sunk by an iceberg doesn't mean it can't be. Yeah. And so that's intellectually interesting, right? Oh, it came up with a low number for climate, and it's based on some inaccurate assumptions. So what? Well, the so what is if that methodology is being used not just by financial institutions, but by central banks and regulators globally to assess the resilience of the global economy and national financial systems to climate change. So you have a deeply flawed methodology which systemically and by definition underrepresents the risks being used to assess the financial system. So we looked at the results the financial institutions are publishing on climate change, and if you look at them, and most of your listeners will be familiar with the concept of a transition to a low-carbon future that limits global warming, and a failed transition or a hothouse scenario in which we trigger climate tipping points and it gets hotter, there's virtually no difference in their results from those two scenarios. So
there's no results between transitioning to a sustainable low-carbon future versus a hothouse Earth in terms of like GDP loss when they run this model.
Yes.
Gosh.
Correct. There's very little difference. So we didn't cherry pick. We looked at a range of major financial institutions. So this is FTSE 100 entities managing hundreds of billions of dollars of your money for pensions. This is investment managers collectively advising, trillions of dollars of pension schemes. This is large pension schemes. And some institutions incredibly showed the hothouse scenario to be economically positive compared to transitioning. Some of them showed it to be almost the same, and some of them, to be fair, did show a small loss. And you kind of ask the question, well, where did this come from? And this came from an organisation, the Network for Greening the Financial System. The Network for Greening the Financial System is a group of central banks and regulators, and in the first generation of their climate scenarios, which were picked up really broadly globally by other financial regulators, they essentially used that Nordhaus methodology, tweaked it a little bit, and said economic damages in a hothouse world are 6% GDP damage. Yeah, they've since increased it to 20 or maybe 21% GDP damage, but for me, still massively undercooking it. Now, I'm not regulator bashing here. Without financial regulators, very few financial institutions would be running this analysis on climate change, but we've come a long way. We come from not running any analysis on climate change back, 8 years ago when Mark Carney gave his seminal speech in 2015 on the financial risk of climate change, to all major financial institutions, most institutions now running tests. But of course, it's incredibly dangerous if the answer they get is, don't worry about this economically. So the best case is it's a really expensive mathematical exercise with no practical value. The worst case is people look at these results and say, hey, it's not going to be that bad.
Which perhaps would explain the state reticence around the world to actually implement any meaningful policy changes.
Yeah, I think so, right? So climate emergency, the definition of an emergency is, a perilous situation where you have to take immediate radical action. So in a car speeding towards a cliff, you slam on the brakes, and actually, if the car's not going to stop in time, you might even jump out of a moving vehicle. That's emergency action, right? So climate change, we're not taking that action. And I think this point on realistic risk assessment is important. I don't know if do you ever go for a walk in the woods or a park near you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Of course.
How would you feel if you saw a cat in the park?
I'd feel quite happy. Quite like cats.
Yeah. What about if it was a big cat, like a tiger?
I would be very confused and rather scared.
Yeah. Would you even go to the park if you heard news that there was a tiger in the park?
Oh, my little brain was like, maybe. I mean, I want to see a tiger. No, I know
Could
that.
I maybe get a selfie for the Insta?
I was just maybe I could climb a wall or climb a tree and just look at it. No, no, no. Of course, I would not do that. That's dumb.
So it's a ridiculous example, but the point I'm making is that risk assessment is incredibly important because it drives the action you take. If it was a tiger in the park, maybe you would go to the park. You'd be pretty bloody careful. And that's the point we're making with this report: is that climate change isn't a tiger; it's a saber-toothed tiger, and it's about to maul us. And so that needs to drive radical action. And I hope one of the things that comes from this report is better acknowledgement of the risks, and in particular, something we propose later in the report is actually trying to link the science, the language of the scientists around tipping points and existential risk and pushing humanity out of the ecological niche in which we've adapted, and threats to the food system and the water system, through existential emergency action, to economic damage. Because if the models are saying it's not going to be that bad economically, well, that's a problem, because as you well know, the economic agenda is massive for politicians. You could say, it's going to go back to a slightly bigger answer to your first question, that's the deal today. We citizens do what we do and live in society on the basis that there will be economic growth and quality of life will improve, and that's how politicians get their gig. So linking this threat to a very significant risk to that deal, I think, is actually an incredibly important message.
Absolutely, I would completely agree. And it's funny that there seems to be how do I put this? There seems to be an evolution in kind of the people who are raising the alarm around climate change, and then those being brought in to be taken seriously. Because I think initially, when it was scientists, people were taking that very seriously. And then as scientists kept warning, I think there's kind of been almost an assumption from the government that they can just probably ignore scientists. What do they know? They're very niche thinkers. But there's something about actuaries and accountants, I feel, that really hold a lot of weight in society. Like, you lot coming out and saying we have a big problem. I hope that will make people listen more.
Yeah, I hope so too. And it's definitely they're actually saying, what are we doing? Why are we looking at climate change? We do pensions, we do insurance. So just to remind people what actuaries do, we're the kind of financial world boffins that often sit in the back of insurance companies and pension schemes. And it's our job to make sure the insurance company doesn't fail, so you get paid out on your home insurance, on your car insurance, on other types of insurance. And it's also our job to make sure that pensions have enough money so that you will receive your pension, often 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from when you're paying into it, right? So actuaries naturally think probabilistically, think long term, think risk, and we're trained to think about the uncertainties and limitations in models, to think about complex combinations of risks, and to think about those over a period of several decades. And we also have a pretty good understanding of the financial system. So actuaries, I think, have a really important contribution to make here. And I got into this back in 2016 when I volunteered for the actuarial profession, and one of my colleagues, a guy called Nico Aspinall, a lady called Louise Pryor, said, "You have to read this report." Okay, very interesting. And I read this report, and this was the first global climate change risk assessment. So not science. I'm going to be quite careful when I talk about this in a second, but risk. What's the worst that could happen? And the British government actually led this under a fantastic climate scientist, Sir David King, and we sent diplomats to India, and we sent diplomats to China, and we worked with the governments and the military around what's the worst that could happen here. And anecdotally, the thing that got the Indians was Bangladesh moving in as sea levels rose, and the thing that got the Chinese was the rice crop failing, because the rice crop's quite vulnerable to heat stress, and as you get more heat spikes, you have that risk. So realistic risk assessment is incredibly important. And that report really got me. I looked at it as an actuary, and excuse my French, had young kids at the time, 2 and 4, went, oh, fuck, we're in the shit here, and became very motivated to work on it. But that's not so much the point. The point is realistic risk assessment is really important. And in 2016, it was 2015 or 2016, that report was published, and it said this is incredibly important. The governments of the world need to be doing this realistic risk assessment. And I guess how many global climate risk assessment reports of that nature have been published since?
None.
Correct. None. I'll see if I've got my, I don't know if you've had a look at Simon Sharp's 5 Times Faster.
Right.
So there's a fantastic YouTuber picked up the report and published a fantastic 15-minute on it, which we can link to. He also talks about Simon's book, and Simon talks about the difference between science and risk, and this is perhaps one of the things we've learned from doing these reports, and something I think is incredibly important for people to understand. First of all, hats off to climate scientists. I have the deepest respect for climate scientists, not just what they do, their depth of knowledge, but also their resilience. I've had the great good fortune and honour to meet with and talk to and work with a couple, Tim Lenton, Exeter, David King, some work with Emily Sugar at Cambridge, and my God, how do they keep going?
I know.
I mean, how do they keep going, right? And the IPCC is this collection of incredible scientists, but 2 important things about science. One, the IPCC is a consensus-driven machine. So consensus doesn't exactly mean, but it kind of does mean averaging. So if you come to me and say, I need to cross this river, is it safe? The IPCC, I'm being a bit glib here, right? But to make a point, the IPCC will come back to you and say, Rachel, the average depth of the river is 0.5 metre. You're safe to cross. You don't care about the average depth of the river,
I want
do
to know
you?
the deepest point in the river.
Correct. And you want to know how uncertain that estimate is. So to illustrate this with climate, one of the most critical assumptions is this assumption, we're going to get a little bit geeky here, equilibrium climate sensitivity.
Okay.
Equilibrium climate sensitivity came up with in the 70s, and this was how much will the planet warm if we double greenhouse gases? So not immediately, but once it reaches a state of equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium, when we double greenhouse gases, you increase greenhouse gases, that causes the Earth to retain more energy than it emits. We can say that scientifically the Earth is in a state of energy imbalance, right? So if we double greenhouse gases, what will eventually go up to? The answer is 3 degrees, right? This is the average, okay? This is the 0.5 metre in the river is 3 degrees. But the IPCC themselves say we cannot rule out it might be more than 5.
Wow.
That's a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's a freaking massive difference. But that is buried on like page 200 of AR6, whatever it is, right? Actuaries would be saying, we cannot rule out it could be more than 5. We need to be extremely bloody careful here until we have ruled that out. Okay, and there's lots of uncertainty around this. So that consensus process is really dangerous because it hides the risks and the tail risks. The other bit that's really dangerous is what I'm going to call scientific reticence. Now, again, I have massive respect for science. You can see in my bookshelves several science books and Stephen Hawking, all that kind of stuff. Like, massive respect. But scientists think differently from risk managers for good reason. The good reason you don't publish in science until you're quite confident, right? So scientists wouldn't say there's an iceberg until they can taste it and touch it and lick it and measure it, all that kind of stuff. So to be conservative in science is exactly the opposite of being conservative in risk. When you say there might be a risk, what would the impact be? If it's too high, we need to take action. We need to take action, right? So here's I'm going to quote from a recent email from a top climate scientist on an incredibly important paper on that topic of how much warming can we expect. And he had suggested the concluding words of the title of his paper were 2 degrees of global warming is highly dangerous. And the journal that was publishing his paper intervened and said they were not going to publish that paper unless the words were changed from global warming is highly dangerous, 2 degrees of global warming is highly dangerous, to 2 degrees of global warming could be dangerous. So that is scientific reticence. How dangerous is that?
Totally.
So that's when you need the scientists to work with the risk managers or actuaries. I think it's critical that we work together. And in the 2015 report, as David King did, we did work. Scientists and actuaries did work together, but critically with the military, with governments, to not just put the science and the risk mindsets together and think about tail events, but also think about impacts to the systems which are essential to our civilization: food, water, those sorts of things, right? And so, just to talk a little bit about why we did this report, I say about 18 months ago, we met Sir David King, a colleague, Oliver Bettis, met him, we had a meeting, and we said, well, why don't we do a paper? So we did a paper, first paper on tipping points, climate emergency tipping the odds in our favour, where we explored both the kind of negative physical risk tipping points, the Greenland ice sheet, ocean current, circulation, dieback of the Amazon, and so on. There are maybe 16 or so of these Earth system tipping points. And it's probably, people might go, oh, what's a tipping point? I'm not quite sure about tipping point. Everyone is really familiar with tipping points because everyone has knocked over a glass of water or a pint or a glass of milk. And things are stable until they become less stable. I'm not actually going to pour water on my lap in front of you, hopefully. And the point is, once it's spilled, it's difficult to put it back into the stable state it was in previously. It takes much more energy, much more effort, maybe practically impossible if the glass rolls off the table and smashes. So if you think about the Greenland ice sheet, thousands and thousands and thousands of years of snow build that ice sheet up. It may melt, it may already be close to irreversible melt. We don't just have to go back to pre-industrial temperatures, we probably have to go back to much colder temperatures to rebuild that ice sheet and put sea level back down. So tipping points are incredibly important, tend to be, one way, incredibly impactful, and there was not great awareness of tipping points. The first paper was on tipping points, just as there are negative physical risk tipping points, so there are positive socioeconomic tipping points. If you think about the classic S-curve of technology disruption, the energy transition is a technology disruption. If you think non-linearly, then actually we're already on the S-curves. We need to hit net zero with some renewable technology. So first report was on tipping points with David King, and that was one of the big points he made in this foreword, is that science and risk think differently and have to work together, and that led to the report we've been talking about, the Emperor's New Climate Scenarios, which was really about this inadequacy of first generation climate scenarios, the risks of that, and what we could do to rectify that going forward.
Excellent. I think let's get into it then. So what were the top findings from the report?
Commonly used climate change models in financial services are underestimating risk. We focused on the hothouse scenario. We asked the question, why do these results not make sense? These results we talked about earlier, which are showing the economic impact of a hothouse scenario to be completely equivalent to a transition to limiting climate change. One thing is the damage function, that Nordhaus damage function, where you essentially say what happened when it got a bit warmer, and extrapolate that forwards. It's a bit mathematical, but depending on the shape of the curve you use, the mathematical equation you use to extrapolate forward, you either get catastrophic damages or you never get damages. So Nordhaus uses what's called a quadratic function. So that's a curve, and it goes up gradually, and depending on how you parameterize it, you get to 6% GDP damage at 3 degrees of warming. So that damage function is incredibly important. Other issues, there's a thing underpinning a lot of climate modelling is a thing called an equilibrium model, which is an economic model of basically global supply and demand and how things might happen. And depending on whether you use an equilibrium model or a non-equilibrium model, which is a model which is slightly more representative of reality without getting into too much technical detail, either an equilibrium model will always show the transition to be GDP negative at cost. A non-equilibrium model will always show the transition to be GDP positive. So just depending on your choice of model, you get a very different answer. So that was the second finding, that we really have to go from talking about the cost of transitioning to talking about investing in our future. Last I heard, when you build something that is an asset that creates value, that's an investment, not a cost. And of course that language is being weaponized, and we're seeing the creation of a wedge issue around the cost of transition, but probably around the UK election next year, for example. And hang on a minute, you're saying, well, how can the transition always be a cost? That kind of doesn't really make sense. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is that all the climate scenario analysis is run from a baseline of climate change isn't happening and the energy transition isn't happening. So if your base case, right. So if your base case is, I'm running my models as if climate change isn't happening, physical risk, and let's not forget the physical risk is never very material in these models, yeah? And the energy transition isn't happening, that's how you always get a negative answer. Pick the energy transition, limit global warming, get a negative answer. Pick a hothouse world, get a negative answer. So we're running all our analysis against a fictional baseline that doesn't exist.
Hold up. How? How is that possible that that's the baseline being used?
Yeah. How is that possible? Because that's how the global financial system works, right? If I'm a bank and I'm producing my balance sheet, then I produce my balance sheet on effectively best estimate assumptions. Those best estimate assumptions, all the modelling I'm doing, are telling me climate change isn't very material. So our global financial system effectively isn't yet accounting for climate change. The accounts, the valuations of assets, the accounts of insurance companies and banks and oil companies and other entities, if the models you're using are not giving you material results for the impact of this stuff, then you don't need to do anything in your accounts. So the base case, and without being like an accounting expert, the base case I would suggest that we're running our economy on today is climate change is a bit of a nothing burger. And so then you do the modelling from that base case, and it always shows negative.
I feel like, hang on, I feel like I still don't get it though. But why is so the baseline is because that's not already baked into the system? It feels like a chicken and an egg thing.
Yeah, it's not baked into the system. Yeah. So let's rewind 20 years. So we knew climate change was a thing, but we didn't do climate change stress testing. We didn't have these models. So you run your accounts and your valuation of your assets and liabilities as if climate change doesn't exist, because you don't have anything that tells you it's going to be material enough to make an impact. And these are, hugely complicated models and data sets and accounting methodologies and the rest of it. And that's how an insurance company, for example, reports its profits. You roll on another year. 2015 comes along. Mark Carney says climate change could be a risk, financial risk. We should do something about it. 2017, TCFD says we need to do strip scenario testing of climate change, and you roll forward another few years, and you've built the mathematical models to test the impacts that we've talked about, but that doesn't mean that they're embedded into asset valuation. It doesn't mean it's embedded into your capital model. It doesn't mean it's embedded into your solvency model, because climate change is still a risk that could happen in financial modelling land, not a thing which you have priced in.
Happening. Oh, okay. So it's that the system itself doesn't have that baked into all of the other models that it's using, and then it comes along and introduces this, vaguely climate function, damage function, Nordhaus nonsense, and it doesn't come out with anything close to
yeah. So if you're let's say you're a pension scheme, you have a big pot of capital, 500 billion or something, and you've got a lot of people that you need to pay pensions to in the future, and so what do you think about? You think about what's going to happen economically, how much money I need to put in today, how much money I can afford to pay people, how long those people are going to live, because I need to keep paying them until they die. What happens to interest rates, because that really impacts how much I need to pay them in the future, blah blah blah. Climate change doesn't yet enter that equation, and there are two reasons I think for this. One, the thing we've talked about, the models are giving very small answers. So if it's very small and quite a long way in the future, it's kind of immaterial. So we wouldn't include it. The other reason I think is that these have been positioned as exploratory scenarios. So what could happen? We could transition and limit global warming, or we could not and have a hothouse world and variations on that theme. Relatively few institutions have actually thought about some have, right? But broadly speaking, relatively few institutions have thought about what is likely to happen and what the impacts could be, and starting to bake that into valuations, into accounting and all that kind of stuff. And I would also say it's really difficult, because it's quite easy to say, all right, if we have a hothouse world and multiple climate tipping points and sea level rise and storms and multiple breadbasket failures and food crises and heat stress and glaciers melting, we can see that at some temperature things are going to go off a cliff, like 3 degrees warming, 4, 5, 6. Pick a temperature at some point, it'll be too much, right? What's really difficult though is to say, so what's the impact on a specific company? If I'm a bank I'm lending to, if I'm an asset manager that I'm investing in, if I'm an insurance company that I'm insuring. So it's really, we can say, if sea level, if Vietnam is inundated at high tide by 2050, as some scientists think is possible, that Vietnam will move before 2050, or parts of Vietnam and other places. What's really difficult though is to say, and so what's the specific impact of that sort of risk in the future on companies that I hold today? And actually, are those risks going to materialize in the next 12 months, or the next 3 years, or the next 10 years? Because if they're not, then do I actually need to be accounting for them today? So I'm not, yes, it's ridiculous, but it's also valid.
Okay, I see. But it's this thing about, the financial system working on such short time frames. This is something that comes up a lot when I speak to people, like this, the obsession with quarterly reports. It's going to be the death of us all.
Yeah. So we've done something amazing with the financial system, and my take on it is this: so post World War II, focus on prosperity. We've just had a big war that was dreadful. There's lots of poverty. Focus on prosperity. How do we grow prosperity? We grow prosperity by growing wealth and GDP, and actually GDP is quite a good proxy for prosperity. It's not perfect, we all know that. GDP was never meant to be a proxy for prosperity, but that's become the heuristic, the shortcut. GDP, prosperity.
Not good at all.
It's not, is it? It's not good at all, no. Again, like the climate modelling, there are some fatal flaws. And in financial services, you need financial services and capital to support GDP growth. You need insurance to underwrite risk and all that kind of stuff. So financial services provides this, should provide this incredible service to society of providing capital to get stuff done, underwriting risk, allowing through pensions people to magically transport money into their future and have a better future, etc., etc. So financial services really underpins, should serve society and underpins social growth. And neoliberalism, in particular, free market economics, that's kind of distilled into the profit is good. And you will hear language, you may have heard language from other guests talking about the difference between financial services and the real economy, as if they're disconnected. So we're disconnecting the impact of the capital we provide from the capital itself. So financial services kind of absolving itself of any responsibility for the impact of the activities it is enabling. So that's part of the problem there. And in fact, if you take it one step further, we've managed to disconnect money from real world impact, and we've also, as I'm sure other guests have talked about, forgotten that the economy rests on society and the society rests on the biosphere. So we've disconnected human economic activity from the construct in which we exist, and that's obviously a dangerous thing to do because it means we have forgotten. It means we don't recognise or value the raw materials that are input to our society, iron, sand, oil, etc. But also we don't recognise the damage we're doing to the life support systems that literally give us the air we need to breathe, the water we need to drink, and the food we need to eat. So, and if, you don't have to be an astronaut to know that mucking with your life support system is a pretty bad plan. So sorry, that was a bit of a classic soapbox rant there, but maybe it helps to explain why financial services is quite disconnected from this.
That's really good, Sandy. A lot of people come on the show and talk about the economy being disconnected to the biosphere, but I like adding in that layer of it being disconnected from society, because it's true. When I think of financial services, I don't think of it serving society in any way. don't think of it serving
Yes.
me. I think of it serving people in the city who use it to generate, a huge amount of wealth for one another, essentially.
Yeah, which is, yeah. So it's clearly kind of, yeah. The perception, perhaps the reality, be that it's kind of slightly forgotten its purpose. There is a transactional, functional purpose of financial services. As I said, providing credit, enabling people to make payments, providing insurance, providing pensions. But for me, there's a much bigger picture purpose. Financial services really should serve society. That, I think this, and rightly, maybe if we go back to climate, COP26 was probably the high tide on financial services. You need to rescue us here. Financial services, you need to capitalise net zero financial services. Now, financial services can do a lot, and we can provide capital, but we're not the arbiters of what we should be financing and could be financing. That's society, that's the politicians. They set regulation. It's we, for example, today we can finance oil and gas, but we can't finance terrorism. You can't, if you're a terrorist organisation, you can't raise money in the global debt markets, right? So society sets the guardrails for the economy. Politicians set the guardrails for the economy, and that's really going right back to Adam Smith. Invisible. Do you know how much the phrase "invisible hand" appeared only once in Adam Smith's writing, and he was really, really clear that moral sentiments needed to guide the invisible hand. So we've taken it. We've let it go just too far in the direction of free market. And I heard a fantastic phrase the other day. I think it's attributed to Kim Stanley Robinson. The invisible hand never picks up the tab.
Ain't that the truth? Well, nice one, Kim. I think that thing of, it's on governments to regulate. With everything that I'm learning about how all of these pieces are interconnected, I'm sure somebody would come back and say, well, talking about regulation as if that's something that governments kind of intrinsically make decisions about without the impact of lobbyists, which come from these big industries, finance industries, ag industries, energy industries. And then the fact as well that ICSID exists, the international, the investor state settlement dispute. So this place where corporations can take national governments to court to sue them for loss of profits for when they change their policies, which happens very often when there's a change of government from one wing to the next. Like, everybody just seems tied up in this sort of monster that we've created. And ironically enough, the financial services being relatively free because they are beholden to their own free market. Now there seems to be a push of kind of looking to this industry that I think a lot of us look upon as morally bankrupt and saying, will you please have the morals to do something about it? And to make the changes that need to happen, because we cannot expect them to come from government because they're too tied up.
Yeah, I mean, there you have it, beautifully articulated. It's really difficult. So we've taken GDP and profit have almost become kind of interlinked in a kind of societal belief about what is good. Clearly, in the States in particular, that kind of free market capitalism has been really driven. Mark Carney actually describes it really well in his book, Values. A lot of US corporations are registered in Delaware, and I think the first case was back in 1916, Dodge versus Ford, when Henry Ford wanted to reinvest his profits in the company, and his shareholders challenged him, and that's been taken further and further. I'm just quoting, and in 2015, Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court ruled that directors must make stockholder welfare their sole end. So yeah, you have legal judgments, societal beliefs, a generation of business leaders who've gone through business school learning this, Milton Friedman doctrine, free market capitalism, a belief that the economy sits separate from the biosphere, all that kind of stuff. So that's why I think this realistic risk assessment is really important. And by realistic, yes, I do mean catastrophic. So pick a temperature 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees at which we lose everything or close to everything. Actually, the point isn't really you can, a portion of humanity survive at 4 degrees Celsius. The point is, and we can argue all day about whether it's 3, 4, 5, or 6, and whether we lose 100% or 90% or 80%. The point more is that if you look at the curve, you start to see significant economic damages above 2 degrees of warming, and it starts to ramp up rapidly above 1.5 degrees. Now, we all know, you and I know, that we're not just talking about economic damages, we're talking about loss of life, mass mortality, heat stress, involuntary mass migration, breadbasket failure, water stress, and so on. But my belief is, unless and until we link those risks which are talked about to a candid, realistic economic damage estimate and are able to show that to policymakers, it might be difficult to really enact policies that treat this as the emergency it is.
Yes, possibly. That's generous of you, I think.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the information's out there; they could find it. But sure, I mean, let's hope. So just to kind of say it really, really clearly. So what we are looking at is we are now looking at between 3 to 6 degrees of warming if we continue as we are, and the economic damages of that could be anything from 50% loss of global GDP to...
Yeah, so it's difficult to be precise, but what we did, if you look right at the back of the report, we talked about the way forward. We talked about the way that climate risks are going to cascade. So global warming is going to cascade into, more sea level rise, more extreme impact, extreme weather events, all that kind of stuff, more disease, all that kind of stuff. And then you can rapidly see that that is then going to start to impact socioeconomic systems, perhaps geopolitical tension, all that kind of stuff, and that's going to impact the economy as we start to get food, water, and fuel shortages. So with Professor Steve Keen, Carbon Tracker, did some analysis where we said, well, rather than working forwards from a past which is not representative of the future, let's work backwards from ruin. And that sounds really dramatic, doesn't it? Working backwards from ruin, but that's why ships have lifeboats. Yeah. And in fact, it's probably important to say what we've done carefully and consistently is to use well-established actuarial principles which we use to run global insurance and pensions markets to run this analysis. And one of those principles is reverse stress testing, which is a fancy name for saying work backwards from ruin. So can I share my screen?
Oh, yes, you can, I believe.
Oh, okay. So this is the picture we drew, and this is.
Can you also explain it for people who are listening just on audio?
Yes, yeah. This is the picture we drew. So what you'll see is some classic S curves on the screen, and the y-axis is percentage damage, percentage loss of GDP. So 100% at the top, 0 at the bottom. So today, 1.2 degrees of warming, we have less than 1% GDP damage due to global warming, but ratcheting up. And temperature is the x-axis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what you'll see is some S curves that go up from a temperature of 1 today up to 3, 4, 5, and go up to 100% GDP damage at 3, 4, 5. Now again, the point isn't so much when do we lose everything, could some people survive. The point is, as you'll see, the losses, depending on how you fit the curve, how you parameterize the curve, start to ratchet up quite swiftly from 2 degrees to 3 degrees. And actually, by the time you get to 3 degrees, you're somewhere between 40 to kind of 80% GDP damage, depending on your rate of warming. So that's kind of the big highlight there. At what point do we expect 50% GDP destruction? Somewhere between 2070 and 2090.
Now, even despite the fact that GDP is not a great measure, that is still a very frightening statement.
If we don't change course and we get to those temperatures, and yeah, absolutely, that's a very frightening statement, because you don't have to think too much to start to imagine what sort of events in terms of food stress, water stress, heat stress, sea level rise, etc., would lead to that scale of damages, and whether it's recoverable. The thing which feeds into that is the equilibrium climate sensitivity piece I talked about. How much and how quickly do we expect the planet to warm? That's the sort of $64,000 question here, isn't it? And that's the next paper we're doing, Climate Scorpion, the sting is in the tail. And Climate Scorpion, the sting is in the tail. What we're talking about there is the tail of the distribution. If you imagine that classic kind of bell curve distribution, the IPCC say equilibrium climate sensitivity is 3. Oh, fantastic. That's the average. So back to our river analogy, what are the tails on this? Plus the risk of tipping points as we go above 1.5 degrees. So really the question is, how much warming are we committed to? What are the risks of that warming? And therefore, how much more rapidly do we need to take action?
Yeah.
And I guess to reiterate that point, that same shape, the S-curve, also gives you hope that we can really accelerate action, because we have a lot of the solutions we need to decarbonise, and policy supercharges the rate of adoption. If you look at EV adoption in Norway, offshore wind in Britain, if you look at the impact of the IRA in America in terms of spending, policy sets the guardrails along which capital flows, and policy can supercharge this. It's my belief that we have to really get this message up to policymakers to supercharge the capital and the solutions.
Have you had any uptake from policymakers, this report?
Not yet, but we're starting to knock on the door. So we've met all the financial regulators who are, without doubt, thinking about what their appropriate response is. We've had some really constructive meetings with financial regulators, and I think next step is, or an important step is, to go up to the policymakers.
Good luck. Anyone listening,
Thank you.
if anybody has any keys to open those doors, please don't hesitate to reach out to Sandy.
Yes. Yeah, get in touch.
Sandy, this was so interesting. Thank you so much. And it was so clear as well. I really appreciate how brilliantly you guided us through that. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you, Rachel. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for featuring it. I'll send you the links to the report and the YouTube. And yeah, those with policy connections, please get in touch.
Thank you so much. Listen, my final question for you before I let you go is, who would you like to platform?
Such a good question. So we spoke earlier about are people still listening to the scientists, and it's a little bit of the boy who cried wolf and that kind of stuff. So I'll tell you who people do listen to, and disproportionately so. It is sports people. Sports people have a disproportionate reach and influence. They're actually just starting to activate on climate change. So when I first got into climate change relatively recently, but about 8 years ago, it was much less topical, and I was kind of thinking, how do we get people interested in this? I've done some work in education and financial education. A particularly successful educational initiative was to let kids pick books on topics they're interested in. So the football kids pick football books, the horsey kids pick horse books, whatever. And it really boosted reading age attainment by, I think, 18 months, like a huge amount.
Obviously, right?
So I thought, well, it's the classic, the most ardent protectors of fish are the fishermen. So how could we get people interested in climate change? And I noticed a charity in the US, Protect Our Winters. It was started by a professional snowboarder, Jeremy Jones, who was going up to Alaska and really noticing the impacts of climate change much earlier than most people. And he thought, well, if the people who love winter sports aren't going to protect winter, who is? So about 6-7 years ago, I started the UK branch to Protect Our Winters UK. So I would really like to platform Lauren McCallum, who is the general manager of Protect Our Winters UK, and we're now working in the UK with about 40 or 50 outdoor brands working in cycling, climbing, snow sports, and there's a really passionate and massive outdoor community in Britain, and we really want to activate that community, particularly around election time, to send a really strong message to policymakers about how much the public know about this and care about this. So I'd really like to champion and platform Protect Our Winters UK and Lauren McCallum specifically.
Excellent strategy, Sandy. Wonderful. Listen, I thank you again. It was such a delight speaking with you.
No, thank you, Rachel. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.